The story of bread begins in a field where wheat grows quietly under the open sky. The wheat stalks stand in rows that stretch across the land, swaying gently when the wind moves through them. Each stalk is tall and slender, topped with a head of grain that holds the seeds within. The wheat has been growing for months, drawing water from the soil and energy from the sun, building itself slowly from a tiny seed into a mature plant. The wheat field is calm and still on days when there is no wind. The stalks stand upright, their golden color becoming deeper as the season progresses and the grain ripens. The heads of wheat are made up of many individual kernels, each one enclosed in a protective husk. Inside each kernel is the material that will eventually become flour, though it does not yet resemble flour at all. It is hard and compact, designed by nature to be a seed that could grow into a new plant. When the wheat is fully ripe, it is ready to be harvested. The harvest happens when the kernels have dried and hardened, when the moisture content has decreased and the grain can be stored without spoiling. The timing of the harvest is important, chosen carefully to ensure the wheat is at its best. The field that was green earlier in the growing season is now a pale gold, the color of ripeness and readiness. The harvesting is done with machines that move slowly through the field, cutting the stalks and separating the grain from the rest of the plant. The machine takes in the wheat at the front, processes it inside, and releases the clean grain into a container. The stalks and chaff, the parts of the plant that are not needed, are left behind in the field or collected separately. The grain itself is gathered and stored, waiting for the next steps that will transform it. The harvested wheat is taken to a place where it can be kept dry and safe. The grain is stored in large containers or buildings where the temperature and moisture are controlled. The wheat rests here, still in its whole kernel form, unchanged from how it was when it grew in the field. The kernels are small and hard, golden brown in color, with a smooth surface. They can be stored for a long time if the conditions are right, waiting patiently until they are needed. When it is time to make flour, the wheat kernels are taken from storage and brought to a mill. The mill is a place designed for grinding grain into powder. The process of milling has been done for thousands of years, though the methods have changed and improved over time. The basic principle remains the same. The hard kernels must be broken down into fine particles that can be used for baking. Before the wheat is ground, it may be cleaned to remove any small stones, dirt, or other materials that might have been mixed in during harvest or storage. The cleaning process uses screens and air currents to separate the wheat from anything that does not belong. The clean wheat then moves forward to the grinding stage, where the transformation into flour will begin. The grinding happens between large rollers or stones that press and crush the wheat kernels. The kernels pass through the rollers multiple times, being broken into smaller and smaller pieces with each pass. The first grinding breaks the kernels into coarse particles. Subsequent grindings reduce these particles further, creating the fine powder that is recognized as flour. The process is gradual and methodical, each stage bringing the wheat closer to the desired fineness. As the wheat is ground, different parts of the kernel are separated. The outer layer, called bran, is coarser and darker. The inner part, called the endosperm, is lighter and contains most of the starch. There is also a small portion called the germ, which contains oils and nutrients. Depending on what type of flour is being made, these parts might be kept together or separated. Whole wheat flour contains all parts of the kernel. White flour is made primarily from the endosperm, with the bran and germ removed. The flour that emerges from the milling process is soft and powdery. It flows easily and has a pale color, ranging from cream to white depending on the type. The flour is collected and may be sifted to ensure uniform fineness. Any larger particles that remain are either ground again or removed. The finished flour is now ready to be packaged or used directly in baking. The flour is stored in bags or containers, keeping it dry and protected from moisture and pests. Flour can be stored for months if kept in the right conditions, though it is best used while still fresh. The flour sits quietly, waiting to be combined with other ingredients to begin its transformation into bread. In its current state, it is still just powder, with no structure or form beyond the fine grains that make it up. To make bread, flour must be mixed with water. This is one of the most fundamental steps in bread making, simple yet essential. When water is added to flour, something remarkable begins to happen at a level too small to see easily. The proteins in the flour, which have been dry and inactive, begin to absorb the water and change. Two proteins in particular, glutenin and gliadin, start to bond with each other and form a new structure called gluten. Gluten is what gives bread dough its elasticity and strength. As the flour and water are mixed together, the gluten network begins to form, creating strands that connect throughout the dough. The more the mixture is worked, the stronger these connections become. The dough starts as a shaggy, loose mixture and gradually becomes smoother and more cohesive as the gluten develops. The mixing can be done by hand or with a machine. By hand, the process is slow and deliberate, with the dough being pressed and folded repeatedly. The warmth of hands and the steady rhythm of kneading help the gluten develop evenly. By machine, the mixing is faster but follows the same principle. The dough must be worked to bring the proteins together and create the elastic network that will trap air and give bread its texture. Along with flour and water, most bread recipes include yeast. Yeast is a living organism, a tiny fungus that feeds on sugars and produces carbon dioxide gas as a byproduct. When yeast is added to bread dough, it begins to consume the sugars present in the flour. As it does so, it releases bubbles of gas throughout the dough. These bubbles become trapped in the gluten network, causing the dough to expand and rise. Yeast can be fresh or dried. Fresh yeast is soft and moist, sold in small blocks that must be kept refrigerated. Dried yeast comes in granules that can be stored at room temperature for much longer. Both types work in the same way once they are mixed into the dough and given the right conditions to become active. The yeast needs moisture, warmth, and food to do its work effectively. Salt is another ingredient that is almost always included in bread. Salt adds flavor, but it also affects the dough in other ways. It strengthens the gluten network and controls the activity of the yeast, preventing it from working too quickly. A small amount of salt helps create a better texture and a more balanced rise. The salt dissolves in the water and becomes evenly distributed throughout the dough as mixing continues. Some bread recipes include sugar, honey, or other sweeteners. These provide additional food for the yeast and can speed up the fermentation process. They also contribute to the flavor and color of the finished bread. Fats like butter or oil are sometimes added as well. These make the dough softer and the bread more tender, and they help the bread stay fresh longer by slowing the staling process. Once all the ingredients are combined and the dough has been mixed or kneaded sufficiently, it is shaped into a ball and placed in a bowl or container. The surface of the dough may be brushed lightly with oil to prevent it from drying out. The container is then covered with a cloth or plastic wrap to maintain humidity around the dough. The dough is now ready to begin its first rise, a period of rest during which the yeast will do much of its work. The dough is left in a warm place, away from drafts and cold temperatures that might slow the yeast. Room temperature is usually sufficient, though a slightly warmer environment can speed the process. The dough sits quietly, looking unchanged at first. But inside, the yeast is active, consuming sugars and releasing carbon dioxide. The gas bubbles form and expand, pushing against the gluten network and causing the dough to slowly grow in size. The rising process is slow and peaceful. Over the course of an hour or more, the dough gradually expands. The surface becomes smoother and more rounded as the dough inflates from within. If the dough is watched closely, The expansion is barely perceptible at any given moment, but over time the change becomes clear. The dough may double in size, or even more, depending on the recipe and conditions. During this first rise, the yeast is not only producing gas but also developing flavor. As the yeast metabolizes the sugars, it creates various compounds that contribute to the taste and aroma of bread. This is why bread that has been allowed to rise slowly often has more complex and interesting flavors than bread made quickly. The time spent rising is not wasted. It is an essential part of building the character of the bread. The gluten network also continues to develop during the rise, even though the dough is not being actively worked. The proteins relax and reorganize, becoming stronger and more elastic. The dough becomes softer and easier to handle. The structure that will eventually give the bread its texture is being built gradually, through the combined action of time, yeast, and the properties of the gluten itself. When the first rise is complete, the dough is ready for the next step. The way to tell if the dough has risen enough is to press it gently with a finger. If the indentation remains and does not spring back quickly, the dough is ready. If it springs back immediately, it needs more time. This simple test shows that the gluten network has relaxed and the dough has fermented sufficiently. The risen dough is turned out onto a clean surface, often lightly dusted with flour to prevent sticking. The dough is then pressed down gently to release the large gas bubbles that have formed during rising. This step is called degassing or punching down, though it is done gently rather than with force. The purpose is to redistribute the yeast and equalize the temperature throughout the dough, preparing it for shaping. After degassing, the dough may rest for a short time before being shaped. This rest period allows the gluten to relax again, making the dough easier to shape without resistance. The dough sits quietly, covered to prevent drying, while the proteins settle. This pause is brief compared to the rising time, just long enough to make the next steps easier. Shaping the dough is a gentle process that gives the bread its final form before baking. The dough might be shaped into a round loaf, a long baguette, or placed into a loaf pan for a rectangular shape. The shaping is done carefully, folding and tucking the dough to create surface tension that will help the bread hold its shape and rise evenly during baking. For a round loaf, the dough is pulled and folded from the edges toward the center, creating a smooth top surface. The dough is then turned over so the smooth side is up, and it is gently rotated on the work surface to further tighten the surface. For a loaf pan, the dough is flattened into a rectangle, rolled up tightly, and placed seam side down in the pan. Each shaping method has its own technique, but all aim to create structure and tension in the outer layer of dough. Once shaped, the dough must rise again. This second rise is often called proofing. The shaped dough is placed in its final location, whether a pan, a basket, or directly on a baking sheet. It is covered again to keep it moist and protect it from drafts. The yeast, which has been redistributed throughout the dough during shaping, begins to produce gas once more. The second rise is usually shorter than the first, but it is just as important. The dough expands again, this time taking on the shape that it will maintain during baking. The surface becomes smooth and taut. The dough feels lighter and softer as it fills with gas. This rise continues until the dough has nearly doubled in size again, or until it passes the finger test, showing that it is ready for the oven. While the dough is proofing, the oven can be preheated. Bread is typically baked at a high temperature, which allows the outside to form a crust while the inside cooks through and the gas bubbles expand fully. The oven needs time to reach the right temperature, so it is started well before the dough is ready to bake. The heat builds gradually, the oven walls and racks warming until they can deliver consistent, even heat. Some bakers place a pan of water in the oven or spray water into the oven just before baking. The steam that results keeps the surface of the dough moist during the first part of baking, allowing it to expand more before the crust sets. This can help the bread achieve a better rise and a crispier crust. The steam is a simple addition, but it makes a noticeable difference in the final result. When the dough has finished its second rise and the oven is fully heated, it is time to bake. The dough is carefully transferred to the oven, using a peel or simply sliding the pan onto the oven rack. The door is closed quickly to keep the heat inside. The dough, which has been sitting at room temperature, suddenly encounters intense heat. The change is dramatic for the dough, though it happens gradually enough that the structure is not damaged. As the heat penetrates the dough, several things begin to happen at once. The yeast, which has been producing gas throughout the rising and proofing, experiences a final burst of activity. The warmth of the oven causes the yeast to work faster, producing more gas and causing the dough to expand rapidly. This initial rise in the oven is called oven spring. The dough puffs up noticeably in the first several minutes of baking. At the same time, the proteins in the dough begin to set. The heat causes the gluten strands to firm up, transforming from soft and stretchy to solid and stable. The structure that was flexible and soft becomes rigid, locking in the shape of the bread. The starches in the flour also absorb water and swell, then gelatinize as they cook, contributing to the soft interior texture of the bread. The surface of the dough dries out quickly in the heat and begins to form a crust. The crust starts as a thin layer and gradually becomes thicker and more developed as baking continues. The high temperature causes sugars on the surface to caramelize and proteins to undergo reactions that create the golden brown color and complex flavors associated with baked bread. The crust becomes firm and crisp, contrasting with the soft interior. Inside the bread, the temperature rises more slowly than on the surface. The moisture in the dough turns to steam, and the steam is trapped inside by the forming crust. The pressure from the steam helps the bread maintain its structure and contributes to the light, airy texture. The pockets of gas created by the yeast are surrounded by the cooked dough, forming the characteristic holes and texture of bread's interior. As baking progresses, the color of the crust deepens. The bread transforms from pale dough to a rich golden or brown color, depending on the type of bread and the baking time. The aromas of baking bread fill the air, released by the chemical reactions happening in the oven. The smell is warm and inviting, a signal that the transformation from dough to bread is nearly complete. The baking time varies depending on the size and type of bread, but it is always a matter of patience. Rushing the process by removing the bread too early results in an underbaked interior. Leaving it too long causes the crust to become too dark or the bread to dry out. The baker watches and waits, allowing the oven to do its work at its own pace. Testing for doneness can be done in several ways. The bread should sound hollow when tapped on the bottom, indicating that the interior has cooked through and the structure is set. The internal temperature of the bread can be checked with a thermometer, looking for a temperature that indicates the starches have fully gelatinized and the bread is cooked. The color of the crust provides visual confirmation that the baking has progressed sufficiently. When the bread is fully baked, it is removed from the oven carefully. The bread is very hot, and the pan or baking sheet is handled with mitts or towels to protect from burns. The bread is taken out of the pan if it was baked in one, or it is transferred from the baking sheet to a cooling rack. The cooling rack allows air to circulate all around the bread, preventing the bottom from becoming soggy as moisture escapes during cooling. The bread sits on the rack, still very hot, releasing steam from its interior. The crust may crackle slightly as it cools and adjusts to the change in temperature. This crackling sound is a sign that the crust has formed properly and is crisp. The steam that escapes carries away some of the moisture, and the bread begins to firm up as it cools. Cooling is an important step that should not be rushed. Cutting into bread while it is still hot can result in a gummy texture, as the interior has not yet fully set. The starches are still soft and the structure is fragile when hot. As the bread cools, the starches firm up and the texture becomes what it should be. The cooling process takes time, often as long as the baking itself, though it requires no active work from the baker. The bread continues to cool slowly, the heat dissipating into the air around it. The surface temperature drops, though the center remains warm for quite a while. The bread settles into its final form, the crust hardening slightly and the interior becoming stable. The transformation from dough to bread is now complete, though the bread will continue to change subtly as it ages. Once the bread has cooled to room temperature, it is ready to be sliced and eaten, or it can be stored for later. Fresh bread is at its best within the first day or two, when the crust is still crisp and the interior is soft and moist. Over time, bread begins to stale as the starches crystallize and moisture is lost. This process is natural and inevitable, though it can be slowed by proper storage. Bread can be stored in a bread box, a paper bag, or wrapped in cloth to keep it fresh while allowing some air circulation. Plastic bags keep bread soft but can make the crust lose its crispness. For longer storage, bread can be frozen, which stops the staling process entirely until the bread is thawed. Each storage method has its advantages, and the choice depends on how the bread will be used. Slicing the bread reveals the interior structure that was created during mixing, rising, and baking. The crumb, as the interior is called, shows the pattern of holes created by the gas bubbles from the yeast. A well-made bread has an even distribution of holes, neither too large nor too small, throughout the crumb. The texture is soft but not dense, with enough structure to hold together when sliced. The slices of bread can be eaten plain, showing off the flavor and texture that were developed through the baking process. The crust provides a contrast in texture and a depth of flavor that complements the softer interior. The bread might also be used as a base for other foods, spread with butter or jam, made into sandwiches, or served alongside meals. Bread is a simple food made from just a few ingredients, yet the process of making it is rich with transformation and patience. The wheat that grew in a field becomes flour through milling. The flour is mixed with water to form dough, and yeast brings the dough to life, making it rise and develop flavor. Heat transforms the risen dough into a loaf with a crisp crust and soft interior. Each step follows naturally from the one before, creating something that has nourished people for thousands of years. The making of bread is both an art and a science. The science lies in understanding how ingredients interact, how gluten forms, how yeast works, and how heat affects the dough. The art lies in the feel of the dough, the judgment of when it has risen enough, the shaping of the loaf, and the intuition developed through experience. Together, these elements create bread that is more than the sum of its parts. In some traditions, bread making is a daily activity, with fresh bread prepared each morning or evening. The rhythm of bread making becomes part of the household routine, as familiar as any other daily task. The dough is mixed, left to rise while other work is done, shaped and baked when the time is right. The process fits into the flow of the day, neither hurried nor neglected. In other settings, bread is made in large batches by professional bakers who have dedicated their work to this craft. Bakeries produce many loaves each day, using larger mixers and ovens, but following the same basic principles as home baking. The ingredients are the same, the steps are the same, and the patience required is the same. The scale is different, but the care and attention remain essential. Commercial bakeries may use automated equipment to mix, shape, and bake bread, but the fundamental process cannot be rushed beyond certain limits. The yeast needs time to ferment, the gluten needs time to develop, and the dough needs time to rise. Even with machinery, bread making remains a process governed by natural rhythms and biological timings that cannot be hurried without compromising quality. Sourdough bread is made using a different type of leavening than commercial yeast. Instead of adding packaged yeast, Sourdough uses a starter, which is a mixture of flour and water that has been colonized by wild yeasts and bacteria from the environment. The starter is kept alive by regular feeding with fresh flour and water, and a portion of it is used to leaven each batch of bread. The process of making sourdough is slower than making bread with commercial yeast. The wild yeasts work more gradually, and the bacteria produce acids that give sourdough its characteristic tangy flavor. The dough may take many hours or even a full day to rise, depending on the temperature and the strength of the starter. The long fermentation develops complex flavors and makes the bread easier to digest for some people. Maintaining a sourdough starter is a commitment that requires regular attention. The starter must be fed regularly, usually every day or every few days, depending on how it is stored. Each feeding involves discarding a portion of the starter and adding fresh flour and water. The microorganisms in the starter consume the new food and multiply, keeping the culture active and ready to leaven bread. The slower pace of sourdough bread making appeals to bakers who enjoy the rhythm of working with a living culture and the deeper flavors that result. The starter becomes a continuing project, a culture that can be maintained for years or even decades. Some starters are passed down through generations, carrying with them the unique blend of yeasts and bacteria that have adapted to a particular environment. Flatbreads are another category of bread that follows a different pattern from leavened loaves. Flatbreads are often unleavened or only lightly leavened, and they are rolled or pressed thin before baking. The dough is made from flour and water, sometimes with a little oil or salt, and it is not left to rise for long periods. The flatbreads bake quickly at high heat, developing a soft, flexible texture or a crisp, cracker-like quality depending on the specific type. Flatbreads include many varieties from around the world, each with its own traditions and techniques. Tortillas, pita, naan, lavash, and many others all fall into this category. The preparation is often simpler and faster than making leavened bread, though it still requires skill to roll the dough evenly and bake it properly. Flatbreads are versatile and can be used in many ways, from wrapping other foods to serving as a base or accompaniment. Enriched breads contain additional ingredients beyond the basic flour, water, yeast, and salt. Eggs, butter, milk, and sugar are added to make the dough richer and the bread softer and more flavorful. These ingredients change the texture and taste, creating breads that are more cake-like or pastry-like than standard bread. Enriched doughs often take longer to rise because the fats can slow the yeast's activity. Brioche is an example of an enriched bread, with a high proportion of butter and eggs creating a tender, rich crumb. Challah is another, traditionally made with eggs and sometimes a bit of oil or honey. These breads are often braided or shaped decoratively, and they are associated with special occasions or celebrations. The extra richness makes them particularly satisfying and slightly sweet. Whole grain breads are made with flour that includes all parts of the wheat kernel, including the bran and germ. This gives the bread a darker color, a denser texture, and a more robust flavor than white bread. Whole grain breads are also more nutritious, containing more fiber, vitamins, and minerals. The presence of bran can interfere somewhat with gluten development, so whole grain doughs may not rise quite as much as those made with white flour. Bakers working with whole grain flour often adjust their techniques to compensate for the different behavior of the dough. The dough may be kneaded longer to develop the gluten, or it may be given additional time to rise. Some recipes combine whole grain flour with white flour to balance nutrition with texture. The result is a bread that has character and substance, with a heartier quality than lighter breads. Rye bread is made with rye flour, which has different properties than wheat flour. Rye contains less gluten, so rye dough is stickier and does not develop the same elastic network as wheat dough. Rye bread tends to be denser and moister, with a distinctive earthy flavor. Rye is often combined with wheat flour to improve the texture while maintaining the rye character. Traditional rye breads, particularly those from Northern and Eastern Europe, often use sourdough starters and long fermentation times. The acids from the sourdough help improve the structure of the rye dough and contribute to the complex flavors. Caraway seeds are sometimes added to rye bread, complementing the flavor of the rye. The bread is dark and substantial, ideal for pairing with strong flavored foods. The crust of bread can vary widely in thickness and texture. A soft crust might be achieved by baking at a lower temperature or by brushing the surface with butter or oil after baking. A thick, chewy crust comes from higher baking temperatures and sometimes from steam in the oven during the early part of baking. The crust is more than just a covering. It adds flavor and texture that are essential parts of the bread experience. Scoring the dough before baking involves making shallow cuts in the surface with a sharp blade. These cuts serve both practical and aesthetic purposes. Practically, they provide a controlled place for the dough to expand during oven spring, preventing the crust from bursting randomly. Aesthetically, they create patterns on the finished loaf that can be simple or elaborate. The cuts open up during baking, creating the characteristic appearance of artisan breads. The patterns created by scoring can be as simple as a single slash down the center of a baguette or as complex as decorative designs on round loaves. The depth and angle of the cuts affect how they open during baking. A shallow cut creates a small opening, while a deeper cut allows for more expansion. The blade is held at an angle to create a flap of dough that lifts during baking, forming an ear or ridge. Bread made in a Dutch oven or covered pot creates a unique environment during baking. The covered pot traps steam released by the dough, creating a humid atmosphere similar to a professional steam-injected oven. This humidity keeps the surface of the dough moist longer, allowing for better expansion and a crispier crust. The pot also provides even heat from all sides, promoting consistent baking. The dough is placed in the preheated pot and covered with a lid. It bakes covered for part of the time. Then the lid is removed to allow the crust to brown and crisp. The contrast between the steamy, covered phase and the dry, uncovered phase creates a crust that is both crisp and deeply colored. This method has become popular among home bakers because it produces results similar to professional ovens without requiring special equipment. Bread can also be baked on a baking stone or steel, which retains heat and transfers it to the bottom of the loaf quickly. This helps develop a good crust on the bottom and can improve oven spring by providing immediate intense heat. The stone or steel is preheated along with the oven. Then the dough is placed directly on it or transferred using a peel. The thermal mass of the stone helps maintain consistent oven temperature even when the door is opened. Baguettes are long, thin loaves that are iconic in French baking. They have a crisp, golden crust and an open, airy crumb. Making baguettes requires shaping the dough into long cylinders, which takes practice to do evenly. The shaped baguettes are placed in a couche, a heavy linen cloth that supports them and holds their shape during proofing. The cloth absorbs some moisture and prevents sticking while allowing the dough to breathe. After proofing, the baguettes are carefully transferred to a peel or directly to the oven, where they are baked at high heat. The long, thin shape means they bake quickly and develop a high ratio of crust to crumb. The crust on a well-made baguette is thin but shatteringly crisp, while the interior is light and full of irregular holes. The flavor is clean and weedy, focused on the quality of the flour and the fermentation. Ciabatta is an Italian bread known for its very open crumb structure with large, irregular holes. The dough is quite wet and sticky, which makes it challenging to handle but results in the characteristic texture. The high hydration allows the dough to spread rather than hold a tight shape, giving ciabatta its flat, slipper-like appearance. The dough is handled minimally to preserve the air bubbles that create the open crumb. Making ciabatta requires a gentle touch and a willingness to work with a dough that behaves differently from stiffer doughs. The wet dough is turned and folded during the first rise rather than kneaded in the traditional way. This develops the gluten while keeping the dough light and full of air. The shaping is minimal, often just cutting the dough into rectangles and allowing them to proof before baking. Focaccia is a flatbread from Italy that is rich with olive oil and often topped with herbs, salt, or other ingredients. The dough is pressed into a pan and dimpled with fingertips, creating characteristic indentations across the surface. Olive oil pools in these dimples, and during baking, it creates pockets of flavor and a crisp bottom crust. Focaccia is soft and tender inside, with a golden, oily crust. The toppings on focaccia can be simple or elaborate. Coarse salt and rosemary are classic, but tomatoes, olives, onions, or cheese can also be added. The focaccia is baked until golden, with the toppings becoming aromatic and slightly caramelized. It can be eaten warm or at room temperature, and it is often torn into pieces rather than sliced. Pretzels are made from a yeasted dough that is shaped into the traditional twisted form and then boiled briefly in water with baking soda before baking. The boiling step creates the pretzel's distinctive chewy crust and deep brown color. The baking soda in the boiling water raises the pH of the surface, which promotes browning during baking and contributes to the unique flavor and texture. After boiling, the pretzels are placed on a baking sheet and sprinkled with coarse salt. They bake until deep brown and shiny, with a texture that is chewy but not hard. Soft pretzels are best eaten fresh and warm, though they can be reheated. The contrast between the salty, chewy crust and the soft interior makes pretzels satisfying and distinctive. Bagels are similar to pretzels in that they are boiled before baking, though they are shaped into rings rather than twisted. The dough is denser than most bread doughs, and the boiling step helps create the bagel's characteristic chewy texture. After shaping, the bagels rest briefly, then they are boiled in water for a short time on each side. Some recipes add malt or sugar to the boiling water, which contributes to the crust color and flavor. After boiling, the bagels are often topped with seeds, salt, or other ingredients while they are still wet, which helps the toppings stick. They are then baked until golden brown and shiny. The interior of a well-made bagel is dense and chewy, quite different from the light, airy texture of most breads. Bagels are often sliced and toasted, and they are popular as a base for various toppings. Rolls and buns are small individual portions of bread, made from the same basic dough as larger loaves but shaped into smaller pieces. Dinner rolls might be shaped into round balls, cloverleafs, or crescents. Hamburger buns are round and slightly flattened, designed to fit the shape of a burger patty. The smaller size means they bake more quickly than full loaves, and they are convenient for serving individually. The shaping of rolls can be simple or decorative. Round rolls are formed by cupping the hand over a piece of dough and rolling it in a circular motion on the work surface. Cloverleaf rolls are made by placing 3 small balls of dough into each cup of a muffin tin. Crescent rolls are shaped from triangular pieces of dough that are rolled up from the wide end to the point. Each shape creates a different appearance and texture. Rolls are often brushed with egg wash before baking to give them a shiny, golden finish. Egg wash is made from beaten egg, sometimes mixed with a little water or milk. It is applied with a brush just before the rolls go into the oven. The egg proteins set during baking and create a glossy surface that is visually appealing and adds a slight richness to the crust. Sweetbreads and rolls include ingredients like sugar, dried fruit, nuts, and spices. Cinnamon rolls are a popular example, made from a sweet dough that is rolled out, spread with butter and cinnamon sugar, then rolled up and sliced into individual portions. The rolls are placed close together in a pan so they rise and bake touching each other, creating soft sides. After baking, they are often topped with icing or glaze. Sticky buns are similar to cinnamon rolls, but are baked with a caramel-like mixture in the bottom of the pan. When the buns are inverted after baking, the sticky topping becomes a glaze on top. Nuts are often added to the topping, becoming caramelized and crunchy. The combination of soft bread, sweet cinnamon filling, and sticky topping makes these treats rich and indulgent. Hot cross buns are spiced sweet rolls traditionally made for Easter, marked with a cross on top. The dough includes warm spices like cinnamon and nutmeg, along with dried fruit such as currants or raisins. The cross can be piped on with icing after baking, or it can be made from a paste of flour and water applied before baking. The rolls are slightly sweet and aromatic, with the cross serving as a symbolic and decorative element. Bread pudding is a way of using bread that has become stale. The bread is cut into cubes and soaked in a mixture of milk, eggs, and sugar, along with flavorings like vanilla or cinnamon. The soaked bread is then baked until the custard sets and the top becomes golden. The result is a soft, pudding-like dessert that transforms dry bread into something rich and comforting. Croutons are another use for stale bread. The bread is cut into small cubes and toasted until crisp, either in the oven or in a pan with butter or oil. Seasonings like garlic, herbs, or cheese can be added for flavor. Croutons add crunch to salads and soups, providing textural contrast and a way to use bread that might otherwise be wasted. Breadcrumbs are made by grinding or processing dried bread into fine or coarse crumbs. Fresh breadcrumbs are soft and moist, made from fresh bread. Dry breadcrumbs are crisp and shelf-stable, made from dried or toasted bread. Breadcrumbs are used as a coating for fried foods, as a binder in meatballs or meatloaf, or as a topping for baked dishes. They extend the usefulness of bread beyond its fresh state. Toast is perhaps the simplest preparation of bread, involving only heat to brown and crisp the surface. Toasting can be done in a toaster, under a broiler, or in a pan. The heat causes the starches on the surface to caramelize and the bread to dry out slightly, creating a crisp texture and deeper flavor. Toast can be eaten plain or topped with butter, jam, avocado, or countless other ingredients. French toast is made by dipping bread slices in a mixture of beaten eggs and milk, then cooking them in a pan until golden brown on both sides. The egg mixture coats the bread and cooks into a custardy layer that is soft inside and slightly crisp outside. French toast is often served with syrup, powdered sugar, or fruit, making a sweet breakfast or brunch dish. Breadcrumbs left over from meals can be collected and dried to make breadcrumbs, or they can be scattered for birds to eat. In this way, even the smallest fragments of bread find a use, nothing going to waste. The cycle of bread from grain to flour to dough to loaf to crumbs reflects a complete transformation, each stage having its purpose and value. The history of bread making stretches back thousands of years, to the earliest agricultural societies that began cultivating grains. The discovery that crushed grain mixed with water could be cooked into a flatbread was a significant development in human nutrition. Over time, the process was refined and improved, with the discovery of fermentation allowing for leavened bread that was lighter and more digestible. Different cultures developed their own bread traditions, using the grains available to them and adapting techniques to their environments and needs. Wheat bread became central in Europe and the Middle East, while rice-based breads and flatbreads developed in Asia. Corn was ground into masa for tortillas in the Americas. Each region's bread reflects its agricultural resources and cultural preferences. The basic principles of bread making have remained consistent across cultures and centuries, even as specific methods and ingredients have varied. Grain is ground, mixed with liquid to form a dough, allowed to ferment if leavening is desired, and then baked with heat. These fundamental steps create bread in its many forms, from the simplest flatbread to the most complex sourdough. The development of commercial yeast in the modern era made bread making more predictable and accessible. Before packaged yeast, bakers relied on natural fermentation or on keeping a portion of dough from one batch to start the next. Commercial yeast simplified the process and reduced the time needed, making it easier for home bakers and commercial bakeries alike to produce consistent results. Mills evolved from simple stone grinders turned by hand to water-powered mills and eventually to modern electric mills. The ability to grind grain efficiently and in large quantities made flour more affordable and widely available. The quality of milling also improved, with better separation of the different parts of the grain and finer grinding producing smoother flour. Industrial bakeries arose to produce bread on a large scale, using machinery to mix dough, shape loaves, and bake many loaves at once. Sliced bread became common with the invention of automatic slicing and packaging machines. These developments made bread convenient and affordable, available to more people than ever before. The trade-off was that industrially produced bread often had less complex flavor and texture than artisan breads made by hand. In recent decades, there has been a resurgence of interest in traditional bread-making methods and artisan breads. Home bakers and small bakeries have returned to longer fermentation times, natural starters, and careful attention to ingredients and technique. The slower, more attentive approach produces bread with better flavor, texture, and nutritional qualities. This movement values the process as much as the product, finding satisfaction in the craft of bread making. Bread remains a staple food in many parts of the world, eaten daily and forming a central part of meals. It is versatile, serving as a base for sandwiches, a side to accompany soups and stews, or a vehicle for spreads and toppings. Bread is also symbolic, featuring in religious ceremonies, celebrations, and traditions. Breaking bread together is an act of community and sharing. The smell of bread baking is universally appealing, evoking comfort and home. The transformation from raw dough to golden loaf is visible and satisfying, making bread baking an activity that engages the senses and provides tangible results. The simple ingredients and the hands-on nature of the work make bread making accessible, while the infinite variations and nuances make it endlessly interesting. Learning to make bread is a journey of understanding the behavior of dough, the effects of time and temperature, and the subtle adjustments that improve results. Early attempts may not turn out perfectly, but each batch teaches something about how the ingredients work together. The dough gives feedback through its texture and behavior, guiding the baker toward better technique. Experience brings an intuitive sense of when the dough is mixed enough, when it has risen sufficiently, and when it is ready to come out of the oven. This knowledge cannot be fully conveyed through written instructions alone. It develops through repeated practice and attention. The baker's hands learn to recognize the feel of properly developed dough, and the eyes learn to judge the color of a well-baked crust. Bread making can be a meditative practice, requiring presence and patience. The rhythmic action of kneading, the quiet waiting during rising, and the focus needed for shaping all invite a slowing down and attention to the present moment. The process cannot be hurried without consequences, and this enforced patience can be calming and centering. The sharing of bread, whether with family, friends, or neighbors, adds another dimension to the experience of making it. Bread that is made at home and given away carries with it the time and care that went into its creation. It is a gift that nourishes both body and spirit, a tangible expression of generosity and connection. Bread made from scratch contains only the ingredients the baker chooses to include. There are no preservatives, no additives, no ingredients that are difficult to pronounce or understand. The transparency of the process and the simplicity of the ingredients make homemade bread appealing to those who value knowing what they are eating. The crust of homemade bread, particularly bread baked in a home oven without special equipment, may not be as thick or crisp as that from a professional bakery, but it has its own charm. The slight irregularities, the variations in browning, and the rustic appearance all testify to the handmade nature of the loaf. These imperfections are part of the character of home-baked bread. Bread can be adapted to dietary needs and preferences. Gluten-free breads use alternative flours and binders to create a product that is safe for those with celiac disease or gluten sensitivity. Vegan breads omit eggs and dairy, relying on plant-based ingredients. Low-sodium breads reduce or eliminate salt for those monitoring sodium intake. Each adaptation presents its own challenges, but bread in some form can be made to suit nearly any requirement. Gluten-free bread making is particularly challenging because gluten is what gives traditional bread its structure and texture. Without gluten, alternative binders like xanthan gum or psyllium husk are used to hold the bread together. The result is often different in texture from wheat bread, but it can still be satisfying and useful. Gluten-free bakers have developed techniques and recipes that produce good results, though the process is quite different from traditional bread making. Sprouted grain breads are made from grains that have been allowed to germinate before being ground into flour. Sprouting changes the nutritional profile of the grain, making some nutrients more available and breaking down certain compounds that can be difficult to digest. Sprouted grain bread has a distinctive flavor and texture, slightly sweet and dense. It is often made without added sweeteners, relying on the natural sugars developed during sprouting. Ancient grain breads use varieties of wheat and other grains that have been cultivated for thousands of years but are less common today than modern wheat varieties. Spelt, kamut, einkorn, and emmer are examples of ancient grains. These grains have different flavor profiles and nutritional contents than modern wheat, and some people find them easier to digest. Bread made from ancient grains connects eaters to agricultural history and offers variety in flavor and nutrition. No-knead bread methods have gained popularity for their simplicity and minimal hands-on time. These methods rely on long fermentation times to develop gluten, rather than mechanical kneading. The dough is mixed just until combined, then left to rise for many hours or overnight. During this time, the gluten develops on its own through a process called autolyse, where the flour fully hydrates and the proteins begin to link. The result is a dough that requires very little handling and produces bread with an open crumb and complex flavor. The long fermentation allows for greater development of flavor compounds and makes the bread more digestible. The trade-off is time. The dough must be started well in advance of when the bread will be kneaded. For those willing to plan ahead, no-knead methods offer excellent results with minimal effort. Overnight rise methods, whether for no-knead breads or traditional recipes, take advantage of the refrigerator to slow down fermentation. The dough is mixed and then placed in the refrigerator for a long, cold rise. The cool temperature slows the yeast's activity, allowing for a very gradual fermentation that develops flavor while preventing over-rising. The dough can be shaped and baked the next day, or even days later, offering flexibility in scheduling. Cold fermentation also improves the texture of the dough, making it easier to handle and shape. The extended time allows enzymes to break down proteins and starches, contributing to better flavor and a more extensible dough. Breads made with cold fermentation often have a slightly tangy flavor and a more complex taste than those made with shorter, warmer rises. Bread machines automate much of the bread-making process, mixing, kneading, rising, and baking the bread in a single appliance. The baker adds the ingredients to the machine's pan, selects the appropriate settings, and the machine does the rest. Bread machines are convenient for those who want fresh bread without the time or effort of making it by hand, though the loaves they produce have a different shape and sometimes a different texture than oven-baked bread. The loaves from bread machines are typically taller and more cylindrical than traditionally shaped loaves, due to the shape of the baking pan in the machine. The crust is softer than oven-baked bread because the bread bakes in a closed container. For those who prefer a crusty loaf, the machine can be used just for mixing and kneading, with the dough then being shaped and baked in a regular oven. Stand mixers with dough hooks can also simplify bread making by handling the mixing and kneading. The dough hook attachment mimics the action of hand kneading, developing the gluten through mechanical action. Using a mixer saves time and physical effort, particularly for large batches of dough or for those who find hand kneading difficult. The mixer must be watched to avoid overmixing, which can develop the gluten too much and create a tough texture. Bread baking classes and workshops offer opportunities to learn from experienced bakers and to practice techniques in a supportive environment. These classes often cover the fundamentals of bread making, from understanding ingredients to shaping loaves to troubleshooting problems. Learning in person allows for hands-on guidance and immediate feedback, which can accelerate the learning process and build confidence. Books and online resources provide detailed instructions, recipes, and explanations of bread-making techniques. Videos can be particularly helpful for visual learners, showing the appearance and behavior of dough at different stages. The wealth of information available makes it easier than ever to learn bread making, though it can also be overwhelming. Starting with simple recipes and gradually building skills is a reasonable approach. Community baking projects bring people together to make bread collectively, sharing the work and the results. In some cultures, communal ovens are used by entire villages, with families taking turns to bake their bread in a shared space. These traditions foster community bonds and ensure that the knowledge of bread making is passed down through generations. Even in modern settings, group baking events can create connection and shared enjoyment. Bread can serve as a way to explore other cultures and traditions. Making pita, naan, or baguettes at home opens a window into the culinary practices of different regions. Each bread has its own story and place in the culture it comes from, and learning to make it is a form of cultural appreciation and exploration. The satisfaction of pulling a loaf of bread from the oven, golden and fragrant, is difficult to overstate. The transformation from simple ingredients to a finished product is complete and visible. The bread is tangible proof of the baker's work and patience, something that can be held, shared, and enjoyed. This sense of accomplishment is one of the rewards of bread making. Bread that does not turn out as expected still has value. A loaf that is too dense can be sliced thin and toasted. One that is overbaked can become breadcrumbs. A loaf that is simply not to the baker's taste can be shared with others who might enjoy it, or fed to animals or composted to nourish the soil. Mistakes in bread making are learning opportunities, not failures. The variables in bread making are many, and small changes can affect the outcome. The type of flour, the temperature of the water, the humidity in the air, the vigor of the yeast, and the timing of the rises all play roles in how the bread turns out. Understanding these variables and how to adjust for them comes with experience. Each batch of bread is slightly different, influenced by the specific conditions of that day. Seasonal variations can affect bread making. In summer, the warmer temperatures cause dough to rise more quickly, while in winter, the cooler temperatures slow everything down. Bakers learn to adjust their timing and sometimes their ingredient proportions to account for these changes. The adaptability required is part of the craft, keeping bread making from becoming too routine or predictable. Altitude can also affect bread making, with lower air pressure at higher elevations causing dough to rise faster and liquids to evaporate more quickly. Bakers at high altitudes often need to adjust recipes, using less yeast, more liquid, or shorter rising times. These adjustments are discovered through trial and error, and they become second nature to those who bake regularly in high-altitude environments. Water quality matters in bread making, though its effects are subtle. Very hard water with high mineral content can strengthen gluten, while very soft water can make dough slack and sticky. Chlorinated water can sometimes inhibit yeast activity. Most tap water is fine for bread making, but those who have issues might try using filtered or bottled water to see if it improves results. The choice of salt in bread making is usually a matter of preference. Table salt, kosher salt, and sea salt all work, though they dissolve at different rates and have slightly different flavors. Some bakers prefer the clean taste of sea salt, while others use kosher salt for its ease of measuring and sprinkling. The important thing is to use salt consistently in proportion to the other ingredients. Sweeteners in bread can be white sugar, brown sugar, honey, maple syrup, or malt. Each adds its own flavor note in addition to feeding the yeast and contributing to browning. Honey and maple syrup add moisture and create a softer crumb. Malt, often used in bagels, adds a distinctive flavor and aids in browning. The choice of sweetener is another variable the baker can adjust to achieve different flavors. Fats added to bread dough can be butter, oil, lard, or shortening. Butter adds flavor and richness, while oil creates a softer, more tender crumb. Lard and shortening were traditional choices before vegetable oils became common, and some bakers still prefer them for certain types of bread. The fat coats the flour particles and interferes somewhat with gluten development, creating a more tender texture. Milk in bread dough makes the crumb softer and adds a slight sweetness. The proteins in milk also contribute to browning of the crust. Milk can be used fresh or in powdered form, with powdered milk being convenient for storage and offering a more shelf-stable option. Breads made with milk tend to stale more slowly than those made with water alone, due to the fats and proteins in the milk. Eggs in bread contribute richness, color, and structure. The proteins in eggs help strengthen the dough, while the fats make it more tender. Egg yolks give a golden color to the crumb, making the bread look richer. Breads like challah and brioche rely on eggs for their characteristic texture and appearance. The eggs are beaten and mixed into the dough along with the other wet ingredients. Potato in bread dough, either as mashed potato or as potato flour, creates a moist, tender crumb and helps the bread stay fresh longer. Potato bread has a slightly sweet flavor and a soft texture that many people enjoy. The starch in the potato absorbs water and contributes to the structure of the bread. Potato rolls and potato bread loaves are classic recipes in many baking traditions. Vital wheat gluten is a concentrated protein powder that can be added to doughs to strengthen them, particularly when using whole grain or lower protein flours. Adding a small amount of vital wheat gluten can improve the rise and texture of breads that might otherwise be dense. It is especially useful in bread machine recipes and in gluten-free baking when a small amount is acceptable to the baker. Dough conditioners are ingredients that improve the handling and baking qualities of dough. Ascorbic acid, sometimes labeled as vitamin C, strengthens gluten and improves volume. Diastatic malt powder provides enzymes that break down starches into sugars, feeding the yeast and improving browning. These conditioners are used in small amounts and can make a noticeable difference in the final product. Autolyse is a technique where flour and water are mixed and allowed to rest before adding yeast, salt, and other ingredients. During the rest, the flour fully hydrates and gluten begins to develop without kneading. When the remaining ingredients are added and the dough is mixed, less kneading is required and the dough is easier to handle. Autolyse is particularly helpful with high hydration doughs and whole grain breads. Stretch and fold is a gentle method of developing gluten during bulk fermentation. Instead of kneading, the dough is periodically stretched and folded over itself. This technique is less aggressive than kneading and helps preserve the open structure of the dough. It is commonly used for artisan breads with high hydration, where traditional kneading would be difficult. The bulk fermentation period is the first rise, when the dough ferments as a single mass before being divided and shaped. During this time, the yeast produces gas and flavor compounds, and the gluten continues to develop. The length of bulk fermentation affects the flavor and texture of the bread, with longer fermentation generally producing more complex flavors. Dividing the dough into portions for shaping must be done with care to avoid deflating it too much. A bench scraper or knife is used to cut the dough, and the pieces are handled gently. Each portion is pre-shaped into a loose round and allowed to rest before final shaping. This rest period, called bench rest, allows the gluten to relax and makes the dough easier to shape into its final form. Final shaping gives the dough its ultimate form before baking. The dough is shaped with tension on the surface, which helps it hold its shape and rise evenly. For round loaves, the dough is pulled and rotated to create a tight skin on top. For oblong loaves, the dough is flattened and rolled, creating layers that will contribute to the final texture. The shaped dough is placed in a basket, pan, or on a sheet for proofing. Proofing baskets, also called bannetons or bratforms, are often lined with linen or made of cane. They support the dough during its final rise and create attractive patterns on the crust. The baskets are dusted with flour to prevent sticking, and the shaped dough is placed in them seam side up. After proofing, the dough is inverted onto a peel or baking sheet, revealing the smooth surface that will become the top of the loaf. The final proof is monitored carefully to avoid overproofing, which can cause the dough to collapse or produce poor oven spring. The dough should feel puffy and light, and when pressed gently, it should spring back slowly but leave a slight indentation. Underproof dough will spring back quickly, while overproof dough will not spring back at all. Finding the right point takes practice and attention. Transferring delicate dough to the oven can be tricky, especially for wet, sticky doughs. Parchment paper can be used as a sling, allowing the dough to be lifted and placed in a hot pot or on a baking stone without directly handling it. The parchment can remain under the bread during baking and will not burn at typical bread baking temperatures. This simple tool makes the transfer much easier and safer. The aroma that fills the kitchen as bread bakes is one of the pleasures of the process. The scent of toasting grains, caramelizing sugars, and developing crust is warm and inviting. It signals that the transformation is nearly complete and that soon the bread will be ready to enjoy. This olfactory reward is part of what makes bread baking satisfying. Listening for the hollow sound when tapping the bottom of a baked loaf is an old baker's trick for checking doneness. A fully baked loaf sounds hollow because the interior has cooked through and moisture has turned to steam and escaped. A dull thud suggests the interior is still doughy. This simple acoustic test works well and requires no special equipment. Allowing bread to cool completely before slicing is an act of patience that is rewarded with better texture and easier slicing. Hot bread is difficult to cut cleanly, as the structure has not fully set. The steam inside needs time to redistribute and the crumb needs to firm up. Waiting for the bread to cool is one of the hardest parts of the process, but it makes a difference in the final quality. The first slice into a cooled loaf reveals the crumb structure and confirms whether the bread turned out as intended. The pattern of holes, the evenness of the color, and the texture all tell the story of how the bread was made. A successful loaf brings satisfaction, while one that is not quite right provides information for improving the next batch. Storing bread to maintain freshness is a balance between keeping it from drying out and preventing mold growth. Bread boxes, paper bags, and bread bags made of cloth allow some air circulation while protecting the bread. Plastic bags keep bread soft but can make the crust lose its crispness and can trap moisture that encourages mold. Each storage method has its place depending on the type of bread and how quickly it will be consumed. Freezing bread preserves it well for longer storage. Bread can be frozen whole or sliced, wrapped well to prevent freezer burn. When needed, the bread can be thawed at room temperature or toasted directly from frozen. Freezing stops the staling process, so bread that has been frozen and thawed can be nearly as good as fresh. This makes it possible to bake larger batches and store the excess. Reviving stale bread can sometimes be accomplished by heating it briefly in the oven. A light spritz of water and a few minutes in a hot oven can restore some of the crust's crispness and make the interior softer. The bread will not be exactly like fresh, but it can be quite acceptable, especially for uses like sandwiches or toast where the bread is a component rather than the main focus. The rhythm of bread making, with its cycles of activity and rest, mirrors natural rhythms and connects the baker to processes that have been part of human life for millennia. The mixing, rising, shaping, and baking follow one another in a sequence that has been repeated countless times across cultures and generations. Participating in this tradition links the present to the past and to the future. Bread made with intention and care, whether by a home baker or a professional, carries with it something of the maker's attention and energy. The time spent with the dough, the decisions made at each step, and the patience exercised all become part of the bread. Those who eat it may sense this quality, even if they cannot name it precisely. The simplicity of bread, made from just flour, water, yeast, and salt, belies the complexity of the processes at work. The chemistry of gluten formation, the biology of yeast fermentation, the physics of heat transfer during baking, all contribute to the transformation. Yet none of this complexity needs to be fully understood to make good bread. The doing teaches, and the bread itself is the reward. Bread continues to evolve as bakers experiment with new techniques, ingredients, and approaches. Ancient methods are rediscovered and adapted, while modern understanding of science allows for greater precision and control. The conversation between tradition and innovation keeps bread making vibrant and relevant, ensuring that it remains a living craft rather than a static one. The loaf of bread that sits on the counter, cooled and ready, is the end of one journey and potentially the beginning of another. It will be sliced and eaten, nourishing those who share it. The empty place where it sat will eventually be filled by another loaf, as the cycle of making continues. This ongoing process, simple and profound, sustains both body and spirit, connecting people to their food and to each other through the breaking of bread.